Hello, hello, and welcome, welcome. It is so good to be with all of you in Zoom land. We are all here and gathering. It's Saturday afternoon, right? This is a glorious day. Welcome, welcome to SphinxConnect 2021. It's great to join you and our three fantastic guests in this virtual space on an incredibly interesting topic. Talking about money is never, never uninteresting, that's for sure. The topic we'll be delving in today is, this is everyone's fight. How philanthropic institutions step forth to support artists and BIPOC institutions. I'm Naimah Bilal, Chief Development Officer of the Children's Literacy Initiative. Before falling, I should say, into the philanthropic space, I led programming for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and long before that, I was an orchestral musician. And so I join our fellow philanthropoids today to have some really interesting conversations, and we hope that you will derive something useful from this. Before we introduce our guests, just want to do a little framing, because of course the moment we find ourselves in is not without extraordinary context. You know, when I think about the title, This is Everyone's Fight, it's got some pretty profound implications for this moment in time. And it left me wondering, well, just what are we fighting for, right? Like, why are we all really here? And in such an extraordinary time, in my view, you know, the fight is clear, right? Like, it's a fight against the most intractable inequity, through which we can, probably the most powerful lens through which we can examine inequity. And that is that of racism and white supremacy. And so with that, we're going to be taking a point of departure that places us at the intersection of the arts and the philanthropic edifice. And so we'll be examining some of those inequities in that space and talking with three extraordinary individuals who are doing work to upend that inequity today. Just a bit of a preview as to the structure of our conversation today. We'll have about 30 minutes of dialogue with our guests, and then we're going to open up the last 25 minutes to questions. So as you're listening, keep your questions parking lotted, and feel free to drop them in the chat once we transition to the Q&A portion. So again, to help us navigate this interesting conversation today, we are welcoming to the SphinxConnect stage three incredible individuals. First up to the stage is Margaret Morton, Director of the Creativity and Free Expansion team at the Ford Foundation. Welcome, Margaret. She has supported grant making in the arts and other forms of cultural expression in this role. Previously, she was the Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. Margaret earned her Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University Law Center and her bachelor's degree in dance and American history from Barnard College. Welcome, Margaret. We're also joined by Susan Fader, Program Officer, Arts Culture at the Mellon Foundation. Welcome, Susan. Susan Fader joined the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in 2007 as a Program Officer for the Performing Arts, and now serves in the capacity in the Consolidated Program for Arts and Cultural Heritage. Before joining the Foundation as Vice President of the Music, she served as Vice President of the music publishing firm G. Schirmer, and she spent 20 years there developing the careers of many leading composers. Welcome.
Thank you.
And now we welcome Mr. Douglas Bitonti Stewart, Executive Director at the Max and Marjorie S. Fisher Foundation. Early in 2007, Doug Bitonti Stewart became the first Executive Director of the Max, Marjorie, and Fisher Foundation. And in this position, he has the privilege of helping the Fisher family further their philanthropic legacy by working with partners and making the most meaningful impact to strengthen and empower children and families in need. Welcome, Doug.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So let's just get right down to it, right? Like, Margaret, I'm going to start with you. Like, again, the context that we arrived at today is immense in proportion. Um, Contextualize this reckoning with white supremacy, and with the pandemic. Um, what kinds of impacts and shifts are you feeling in your work at Forward?
First of all, I want to thank you, Naimah, and Doug and Susan for joining me in this conversation, and also a shout out to AFA and the Sphinx family for continuing to really nurture this community, this network of musicians and arts leaders across the country. Sort of more important networks are more important than ever. So I just want to say that, and also thank all of those musicians and arts leaders who have really held it down this past year, struggled to manage their organizations, their careers, yet continued to play and to share art with us, which helped us all, I think, keep it together, as they say. This year has been incredibly sobering for us at the Ford Foundation, on the issue of how white supremacy actually has driven and shaped inequality. That has really driven our mission. That was our mission before the pandemic. We work internationally across 9 offices, in addition to New York City, but across 9 offices that include China and Indonesia, across the continent of Africa, South America, and Mexico. And we have been, under our president, Darren Walker's leadership, focused on inequality for the last 5 or 6 years. We believe it's the defining issue, really, of our times, that has been that race and wealth have really been drivers of the inequality that we see across the world. This pandemic, unfortunately, has really magnetized for us that inequality, particularly when we see Black, Latinx, Indigenous people, disabled people being heavily, disproportionately devastated by it because of underlying health, to see Asian people who have been demonized by it unfairly and with ignorance. It just really magnetized our mission, which is really supporting and disrupting inequality. And I will just say, the 3 things that really arose in this past year, starting with the pandemic, moving to a racial awakening, really, because of the police events, of the white supremacy that continued to live among us, but that which we really overlooked. But it really brought that to the fore, and now we see that it's thriving. It's thriving. White supremacy and extremism is thriving. So, unfortunately, those are some of the sort of driving collectors that we see in our work, and it's just affirmed, actually, our strategy.
Yeah. What you're saying to me is just absolutely vital, and that is, of course, this is the defining challenge of our time, right? And so my question for, let's ask Doug this question. The philanthropic edifice is known to be an exceptionally white space, right? So how do foundations interrogate whiteness in this time, and what does that look like? How does that play out practically?
So, very big question. And so I will start with the 3 fingers pointing back at me as I point fingers at something. And so let me just offer a couple of acknowledgements even before I answer that question. I too want to thank Sphinx and Aaron and Afa and the whole team and all of the artists that are here today. Let me acknowledge that in the spirit of Native American land acknowledgements, I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, that is part of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. I am not trained in Native American land acknowledgements, but it's something that will come up later in the discussion about one thing that we're doing with at the foundation that I serve. But I'm also happen to be a white male, cisgender, privileged, able-bodied, 6'2". I've got all sorts of things that I'm dealing with relative to a world that was designed mostly by men who look like me, for men that look like me. So that's something that's really important. So I'm doing a lot of my own personal work, so you know, because you asked me about the edifice of philanthropy, but the edifice of philanthropy is made up of individuals that have to do their own work. And so I'm a huge optimist to a fault. So I surround myself with enthusiastic skeptics, but one of the things that I even feel a little skeptical about, and Chas Miller, who did this work behind me, said at one point, he said that, yeah, it is. And this is only a study of this 8 by 8 foot piece of art that he does. If you want to learn about Chas Miller, look at his Instagram on Chas Miller Originals with a Z. In any event, he said to me one day, he said he felt like he was being gentrified. And I was sitting next to him in a meeting in Brightmoor in Northwest Detroit. And I said, tell me what does that mean? And we were in this big meeting about the arts and the role that it would play in the neighborhood and what did the neighborhood want. And yet there were 2 white men and 1 black man at the front of the room, sort of facilitating all of this. And he said, I've had good ideas for 30 years and nobody listened to me. And so now they're coming with this idea and they're saying, look what we've got. And they're not talking to me about this. And in some ways, the philanthropy is gentrifying. This is going to be, I'm willing to make mistakes. I'm willing to be called in and out. I'm still learning. Okay, so let me have it. I've made some pretty healthy mistakes in my own journey. But philanthropy is gentrifying racial equity in some ways. And what I mean by that is that it won't be genuine if individual leaders do not do their individual work. It won't be enough if we hire all the consultants, because if there's one thing philanthropy can do is hire consultants. We're really good at that. Every grant partner of ours knows that. So we have to do our own personal work. So I'm a little bit disheartened by institutions that are doing work in racial equity, but then when I poke into and I get access to folks and I start asking them questions, I don't see the introspection. You know, it's personal, interpersonal, it's institutional, it's structural. So instead of starting at the structural level, it's an and individual leaders, in particular white leaders, got a lot of work to do. And I think that that's what is beginning to change. I will be much happier to share with you, Naimah, that the philanthropic industrial complex is making great strides when the leaders in it who happen to be white, in the vast majority, have done their personal work. So I'll stop there. There's so much. This is such a huge conversation.
It's huge, and obviously we don't have time to boil the ocean of
we do not.
An immense conversation today, but I'm curious to hear Susan's viewpoint. What kinds of insights are you sitting with in context of this moment?
Well, I don't know about insights, Naimah, but first of all, let me add my thanks to AFA and Sphinx and their staff. I'm really sorry not to be in Detroit this week. It's become an annual pilgrimage that I so value. I'm calling in from the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger, otherwise known as Irvington, New York, in the Hudson Valley north of Westchester. I think that philanthropy can obtain insights from where we sit, but we also exert an undue influence. Contributed income from philanthropy, from funders, from foundations, it amounts to about 13% of total giving. So the fact that you've got 3 funders on this panel, and not individual donors who are the most reliable foundations, basis for nonprofits, the health and resiliency of the nonprofit sector. And I think that the nonprofit sector has come through this horrible year as well as it has because of the generosity of people who have turned tickets into donations and up their giving even at a time of perhaps personal distress in order to maintain the value of the arts and culture sector. And what have I seen this year? I've seen just an enormous resilience. I've seen the ability of organizations to reinvent themselves on a dime, of service organizations to reinvent themselves, to create content and value and networking and sharing of spirit, to keep buoying up people who are isolated, in ill health, possibly unemployed, and to keep us going. So, that's from where I sit, I see that. And from where I sit, we've had, opportunities to try to impact that in ways that are extraordinary for the Mellon Foundation, but not extraordinary in terms of the need that the sector actually has to come through this and to to come through it stronger and better. I think that the pandemics of the year have caused an acceleration of reckonings that are long overdue. And if there's a silver lining to the past year, I think that that's happened. And I think that the progress will be inexorable in one direction, if not fast enough.
Yeah. Oh, it's a wonderful thing to recognize that there is, there's some progress being made, but yet the journey is ongoing, right? So Margaret, I want to ask you a question because, Ford Foundation to me is pretty exceptional in its thought leadership about the origins of philanthropy or philanthropic culture. And if you look back, many, many years ago, Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, and then Anand Giridharadas kind of picked that up with Winners Take All. And then after Giridharadas, Darren Walker, president and CEO of Ford Foundation, wrote From Generosity to Justice, a new gospel of wealth. Can you talk about how, thank you, Doug. If you don't have that book, get it. It's an incredible new recasting of a philosophy, which is in some ways a wholesale rejection of the sort of the Gilded Age, right? Impressions of philanthropy. So how has that thought leadership spurred your work forward? So you're not just doing the work of granting to arts organizations and numerous other initiatives and efforts, but you're actually leading out front as thought leaders in this space. How has that shaped the work as well?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I have to say, it is pretty awesome to be able to work with a leader like Darren, who is not only leading our institution, but really having an influence on the larger field. It is pretty awesome. And I haven't been in philanthropy long, and so I am not one of those thought leaders in philanthropy, but it's been wonderful to be a part of it and to learn from his leadership. I think for me, especially in this moment, kind of an example of Darren as activist that is really kind of exemplified was his advocacy during the pandemic when he was listening really closely. He was meeting with people all the time at the beginning of the pandemic when we really felt like we were in just a downward spiral and didn't know where we were going. He listened very closely across the fields that we fund, from the civil rights groups to reproductive rights groups to the arts groups, and so many of them who were Black. And he was alarmed and just felt that there had to be some kind of urgent action now by him and his colleagues. And he pressed to push to expand beyond the normal payout that we do as a matter of law of 6%. And he expanded that. He went to our board and advocated to expand that to 10%, which was pretty dramatic, and to get our board to approve a a social bond transaction that would let us have $1 billion to distribute over 2 years to really help support and sustain our colleagues. Not only did he do that, which was to help give a lifeline to our grantees, but he influenced other foundations in doing that as well. And Mellon is an equal leader, as I think we all know, is one of those foundations that also pressed and spent beyond to be able to anchor the field at a time of kind of a fire, in a fire, as he talks about firefighters. I will just give one example of what we were able to do with that also shows, I believe, the generous side of philanthropy. There's a program called America's Cultural Treasures that Darren also inspired to help invest to give relief to organizations of color across the country, because they have been undercapitalized relative to their colleagues in the field. Part of those social bonds went to challenge other foundations across the country to also invest in organizations of color, special programs. And today, there are 10 foundations that are working as a collective to really support organizations across the country, and with passion and with learning. And it's I think it's worth noting as just another moment of philanthropy being generous, shall we say.
Yeah, I want to dig into this a little bit more deeply with you, Doug, because you shared something earlier that had to do with how Fisher Foundation is doing things differently. So when it comes to operationalizing equity, like, what does that look like on a practical level for your organization today?
So I appreciated your comment earlier about boiling the ocean, because there's so much here. So for us, tangibly, I can focus on two elements. One is that in 2014, a study came out in Detroit that showed so clearly that the vast majority of grants coming from Michigan-based foundations were going to majority large arts organizations, and the majority of those were led and served primarily the white population, majority population. And so we needed to invert that pyramid, even at the foundation that I work at. So what we did was we went to our board and we grant about $14 million a year. And we asked them for $6 million over 5 years to do essentially a capacity building body of work with smaller organizations, or large, if that happened to be the case, but they were primarily small organizations that were led and served primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so that program, which before we were certainly open to making grants, but program grants, and we need all of this paperwork, and foundations are not easy to get money from. We all know that. This just flipped it and said, okay, so we're going to do this. The grant awards are already there. What should we do? What do you need? And so it started with them at the center instead of us saying, here's what we want you to do. So we didn't come in saying, so you all need governance work, you all need business, you all need this. No. We said, you all have different needs. So we're here to listen. We've placed money aside so you don't have to compete with each other, because it's based proportionally on your operating budgets, which is fair or not fair, but at least you don't have to compete with each other. And so let's find out from you what you really need. And so we've been doing that for the last 5 years. The other thing that we're working on, a good friend of ours, Dwan Dandridge from Black Leaders Detroit, taught me a lesson one day. He said, sharing resources is one thing, sharing power is another. And we're looking at our power on our asset-based side, because we, along with the Ford Foundation and FB Heron Foundation and others, and certainly Mellon as a bank and also as a foundation, and et cetera, we're looking at the other 95%. And when we look at that, we're also, just yesterday, we had a meeting with Upstart Collabs, who is creating investable opportunities that are justice filled in the creative economy, so that we can start not only doing our grants in all these ways, but that we can also make sure that the other 95% is also being invested to create positive impact. Chaz is an individual artist that needs to, he doesn't have a C3 that he works with, right? The Merit team, they have a C3, great. We need to be ready to work with individual artists and organizations. So we're going to focus on our assets as well as our grants in this way. So
tends to view it through, because it's a capacity building on both sides, right? You know,
yeah,
it's capacity
we need to
building.
build our capacity.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
It's a two-way street there. Susan, so Margaret touched on a really interesting point about, the lion's share of funding historically, but also today going, for diversity efforts, going to white-led organizations that are predominantly white institutions. And there's a sort of trickle-down affect, right? And one of the questions I've been sitting with is about regranting, because of course it's an extraordinarily efficient way to grant, and it's also a way to, pass through much needed funds to organizations who know the people who are doing the work. But are there some unintended consequences of regranting that pick winners and losers? And also, what have you seen in terms of regranting that has been positive?
Well, thank you, Naimah. It's a great question. I am a fan of regranting because I'm a national funder.
Yeah.
And we have responsibility across the country, we feel, and we're based in New York. And that gives us certain kinds of prejudices and biases. And as much as we were on the road until 2020, we can't be everywhere. And so I know, as a national funder, if I think about New Opera and the companies in this country that are committed to a consistent revitalization of the repertoire, I can more or less tell you what those are. If I were going to try to do that for modern dance or theater, ensemble theater, or individual artists, I couldn't possibly do it. So for the Mellon Foundation, regranting gives us an opportunity to support more broadly and through intermediate organizations that are closer, have their ears to the ground closer than we possibly can. That has its good sides and its bad sides. And in terms of the equity issue that you raised, I think that the peer review panel process is probably more equitable than my staff of 12, or the arts and culture team staff of 12, it's not mine, trying to make decisions. And so it means we can work in multiple tiers of influence. The work we do directly as an arts and culture team tends to look for systemic change and for visionary leaders and organizations willing to work collaboratively to make change happen. Our regranting programs get us closer to the ground and broader. So to speak, to what we did last year, we couldn't possibly have gotten the extra $200 million out the door that our trustees authorized on top of the Mellon, the base budget of $300 million without regranting programs. So in New York City, we set up a COVID-19 relief fund in collaboration with other funders. We set up a regional arts resilience fund in collaboration with the 6 regional arts organizations, Arts Midwest, New England Foundation for the Arts, et cetera. We set up with US artists based in Chicago, another funder collaborative that was able to get $5,000 grants to individual artists, which was vitally, vitally important to us because we don't make grants directly to individual artists. And then realizing that that program was really hitting artists that had attained national reputations, we set up a complementary program through the Intercultural Leadership Institute that was run from the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures that was going to get to artists that are extremely important on a community level, but don't necessarily rise through national awards. That's, that's a handful of the regranting programs we did last year. We also have longstanding programs like the National Dance Project, the National Theater Project, and getting more specific for the cause of this conference, the National Alliance for Audition Support, which is a regranting program that gets money into the hands of individuals. And that's been talked about in several panels. I'm very pleased and proud to say.
That's
So
excellent.
let me just say one other thing about regranting. As I say, the positives is it gets that money out the door more broadly. The negative is that it doesn't have the direct relationship between the funder and the grantee. And we know that a Mellon Foundation grant can leverage other funding. So when a artist gets a grant from NAS, it goes back to Sphinx before it goes back to Mellon. When there's a National Dance Project Award, it goes back to NIFA, not to Mellon. And we hear from grantees over and over again the importance of having a Mellon grant. So that part is lost.
Absolutely. That's an incredible point to raise too, and that is leveraging gifts from major foundations can lead to further gifts. Really excellent point. So we want to leave time for Q&A, but I want to close out with a question to each of us. We've come full circle with this question of like boil the ocean, right? Like that's always been sort of this countervailing force against making real change, right? It's like, well, we don't want to boil the ocean. Well, that approach and that ethos, has this sometimes intended, sometimes unintended consequence of stagnation. So the question is, how do we avoid incrementalism? And to build on that, if we were world building together and dreaming up a different space together, were we not entrenched in a place of inequity, what would the arts landscape even look like to you? Is that even a world you can imagine? Margaret, let me start with you.
Thank you. I just want to also thank Susan. I don't know what the arts landscape would look like without the Mellon Foundation. And I say that as someone who had been a public funder on the ground in New York City, and just really affirm how important it is that whoever the funder is have knowledge of the field. And so I just really appreciate that scale of regranting that is going on by Mellon, because we need it. What would it look like taking away everything? I am an optimist, and I will try to point to some of the trends that we are now seeing in our field because of DEI, because of the pandemic and the racial reckoning and all of the work that we're doing. I see two trends. I see that funders and large funders are trying to learn. There is a spirit of learning and recognition about past systemic problems in earnest, and it's happening and it's playing itself out. Examples are things like the Mosaic Fund, which Mellon has supported generously, led by Maureen, or founded by Maureen Knighton of Duke and Kerry McCarthy of New York Community Trust. It's a learning community of funders across the landscape in New York City who are funding organizations of color, and half of it is funding and half of it is learning to undo a lot of practices that have been, had inhibited their more generous funding. And that is a great model that is in place. America's Cultural Treasures, as I mentioned, is a constellation of foundations, from the Getty in LA to Houston Endowment to Heinz in Pittsburgh to Barr, and I don't want to mention too many because I'm leaving some out, but they have stepped up and met the challenge of raising $3 million to $3 million and investing them in targeted designed programs for organizations of color in their communities and states. And South Arts is a recent one who will be joining us. It is, again, those funders are learning together, and they're learning how to fund more generously and consistently to organizations of color. That is happening. The other thing that the reckoning has given us is Black creatives and artists stepping up and asserting their power in a generous way for their field, and to undo problems. From Black Theater United, who Mellon and Ford support, well-known theater stars have formed a coalition to challenge the racist systemic problems on Broadway and to make change. There's a wonderful theater initiative, the Black Seed, which is led by Indira Ituragwu, also Mellon generously supported, is a coalition of theater leaders of Black theaters across the country who have created a organization to fund smaller theaters of color, Black theaters across the country. Again, the kind of generosity we've seen coming from artists, to me, has been the most dramatic and the most moving. There's a Latinx organization in New York City of arts leaders who are, pretty healthy and successful, who formed a coalition to advocate for money for other smaller Latinx organizations. So we're seeing a real spirit of activism among artists in the field. And I'm sorry not to mention, just to mention a few, but I think in tandem with funders who are trying to change their working models, that gives me hope.
Doug, what about you?
So let me say that I want to celebrate. Atul Gawande wrote an article called "Celebrating the Heroism of Incrementalism." Now that's about as funder speak as you can get, almost, right? But he wrote it, and he's, So I want to celebrate the heroism of incremental changes that are durable. And so one of the durable incremental changes where we're building our capacity is that Gwen Shivers and Pam Weaver, two leaders in Brightmoor, taught us a lesson that we'll never forget. And that is that our titles are getting in the way. So, and it's, program officer. So for them, or network officer, for them, and this was two women of color talking to another woman of color saying, do you hear that? Do you hear what's in that title? And they're like, program network, is that the problem? No, officer. Are you policing our work? Is that what you're supposed to do? That was after 10 years of a relationship with these women, right? And so they finally felt comfortable saying, so they came back, we've now changed it. And we're trying to get the entire sector to change it. What we hear from national funders is that, well, we're not close enough to the ground. And so it's great that you're doing that, but it doesn't really work for us. But meanwhile, the individuals on the ground keep hearing this title over and over again, and they haven't said it to everybody. So we changed it to program partner, but we did that because the women in Brightmoor gave us 21 other options that were better for them. And then they said, we're going to pull a Fisher on you. And we thought, okay, now we're going to learn something, right? Okay, what does that mean? And they said, we don't know what works best with your other colleagues. So we'll let you choose. Here's our top 3. If you don't like any of those, we'll give you the second 3. And we'll keep going until we find something. And their first choice was ours. So we have program associates and we have program partners. And then we have grant partners and so forth. So incrementalism, but I'll finish because I know we need to get to Susan's input on this and questions, but imagine a time. So let's go to the boil of the ocean. Imagine a time in arts and arts funding in the creative economy where instead of amazing leaders chasing money, and the vast majority of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are chasing money in the cultural sector are chasing it from foundations. They're chasing it from us. I know the 13% and so on, but I've been called out on plenty of panels that say the smaller groups are still disproportionately relying on foundation grant making. So imagine a time when instead we were chasing them. and they had applications we had to fill out. What would be on that application? And what would our answers be? So we did that exercise. I won't go into it, what we found, but imagine that. And the fact is we have the power to actually act that way now. We can actually ask questions and say, you know, in our own applications, we can utilize our power and try to live that now. And we still have to make decisions, and et cetera, but imagine a time when we had to fill out applications to give money to arts organizations.
We're gonna sit in that vision. Susan.
I do want to leave some time for questions, so I'll just answer this quickly. And I think that foundations at their best are at their best when they are being incubators and catalyzers, but that we also have a responsibility to be midwives and to be nurturers, and that the most systemic change doesn't come instantly. And 2020 will be, in retrospect, I think, a year of catalytic change, but our responsibility then is to stay the course. And long-term commitments are what bring about enduring change. And foundations can be fickle, and their leaderships change, or their boards change, or there is a new idea. And I think that we need to be careful in how we make our changes and how we sustain them. More than 30 years ago, Mellon made a commitment to try to change the professoriate and to bring students of color into the humanities. And we look at that in retrospect, and if we'd left it after 10 years, which is a long time in funding, we could have declared victory, and we would have placed a couple of dozen PhDs into academia. Now there are over 800 PhDs who are occupying positions as presidents and provosts and tenured professors and mentors to students, and that's because we had an enduring relationship. So I believe both in incrementalism and in catalytic change.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was incredible. Want to open up to many audience questions here. So just reminding everyone who is sitting at your desktop, your phone, your laptop, go ahead and pop your questions in the chat. We've got many here. There's one question that someone asked a bit ago. Please restate the title of the book you mentioned. I wasn't sure which one. It may have been From Generosity to Justice, A New Gospel of Wealth. The other one we mentioned, other one I mentioned was Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas, and Dark Money by Jane Mayer. So one of those has gotta be it. Next question here. Since prioritizing DEI work and committing to increased funding of BIPOC artists, how does your organization approach accountability and measure your actionable goals? Margaret, that's yours.
Wow. We have been crafting an evaluation of our grant making, and it's not on an annual basis, but it will actually evaluate our strategy of how we're investing now, which is investing in people of color and disabled people. And it will probably look at 5 years. So between 16 and 21. And we are doing that evaluation of what has been the impact. Have we made a shift? Have organizations gotten stronger? Those are the kinds of impacts that we will look at. What do those organizations feel? What do they value? Or what do they think their improvement has been with our grant? We're actually not less interested in our own questions than we are in the views of the leaders of the organizations that we fund. But that's just a kind of a sum up of how we structure our evaluation that we are still working on.
Great, and then the process is iterative, right? And it'll continue to evolve. Question 2, let's see. Do you think it is possible for the current philanthropic structure to be truly equitable? Or do we need a new model? Doug?
Oh, wow. So So truly equitable, probably not. I mean, just to be honest, no, I don't think so. I think that we can get a lot closer. I think we can get a lot closer when guys like me step off the podium and somebody who looks different leads the institution. And I'm told I look a lot younger than I am, which is kind, but I'm 51, so I still have a pretty good runway to go here. But I need to probably step away from this podium at some point soon, soonish. So there's some things I need to do. I think that we'll get closer to equity when the dollars that are fueling philanthropy are invested in justice-filled work. It's a logical fallacy that if you align your assets with your values, you will lose money. It's not true. It's been proven over and over again. And so if we can do that, and actually, I think if we can push the market, and I know Larry Kramer disagrees with me, but I wrote him a letter and it got published. This is from the Hewlett Foundation, that foundations all need to do this, that it will shift the market, that we need to change how money is made. And part of that are the decisions that we make as institutions to align how we're making this money with then how we're giving it away. So, because if all we do is make our grant making equitable, which is extremely important, and we've been working diligently with a family foundation to introduce BIPOC leaders into decision-making roles, as well as into our staff, which has had tremendous change. We're a small staff. But if we don't get the investments right, then we're just scratching at the surface. There are plenty of things that we're creating on our asset side that we're trying to undo on our grant making side.
Oh, such an extraordinary point, Doug. The context is also deeper because there is reputation laundering, right? And there are other motivations that are not magnanimous that earn the money in the first place. And so it's an extraordinary, questioning the system, right? It's getting a little closer to, how are people making their money where they've got these extraordinarily amassed wealth, fossil fuels, opioids, to name a couple. Margaret, I see your hand is up. Did you have a point? Did you?
Just very quickly, I also think we need more local community foundations and more local community foundations led by people of color and younger leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, just finding ways to bring individual wealth into philanthropy more effectively than it has now, and to move some of those dollars into, I don't want to say away from PWI organizations, but into, because I think there's enough wealth to go around. And I think that in the absence of a government that is going to support arts and humanities significantly, and I don't see that changing in the US anytime soon, that private foundations are necessary in the ecosystem in order that organizations not become too dependent on their earned income and price themselves out of existence. So these are interlocking parts. It's a jigsaw puzzle, and private philanthropy has a role in it, but we just like to make the pie bigger rather than divide it into more pieces.
Yeah. So I'm going to stick with you, Susan, for a second. Mm-hmm. So the next question is, how can we ensure that philanthropic organizations are committed to long-term efforts to fund BIPOC artists and orgs beyond the current cultural moment? It's popular to do so.
Thank you for asking that question. I think Grant Makers in the Arts, on whose board I serve, 5 years ago, started fostering education on racial equity and identified that as a priority issue, as it had capitalization 5 years before. And Grant Makers in the Arts is a wonderful learning organization for us as funders. Yeah. And as I said, Mellon's commitment, as I said, in the professoriate goes back 30 years. So this didn't just happen. And I think when Barack Obama became president, was the year that we made our first grant to Sphinx. We have had African-American presidents now for 8 years, 2 of different ones at the Mellon Foundation. Our board chair until recently was African-American. And I think that changing the structures of organizations is one way to make sure this is not just a moment. Yeah. To your question about evaluation, I'm just going to add just very briefly before, our museums program did a survey about board and executive leadership in museums about 4 years ago that's been enormously influential as a baseline. And we are at the moment piloting a grantee demographic survey about what our leadership and boards look like across the foundation. So this will be something we will need to do periodically just to see how to measure progress over years. But I think we will continue to hold our feet to the fire, particularly when you have a Darren Walker and Elizabeth Alexander on the phone to each other probably multiple times a day, every day, trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah, and it's not lost on any of us too. I mean, this is a very meta conversation, right? I mean, we are here being hosted by Sphinx. And we're with a group of funders talking about what it looks like to elevate Black-led organizations or organizations that center Black and Latina artists, right? It's extraordinary what Sphinx has been able to do with that kind of investment. So let's keep that in our sights too. Margaret, I see your hand raised again. No? Okay, it's just perpetually up there. All right, let's go into this next question. Let's see.
While you're looking, Naimah, I'll just say that Aaron Dworkin got on the stage of Carnegie Hall, 7, 8 years ago, lamenting the lack of change, and Sphinx was probably then about 13, 14, 15 years ago, so old at that point. And I think the progress that we've seen, with 100 organizations participating as paying members of NAS, of the SOPA, organization auditions being attended by many, many orchestras, by a willingness to hire substitute musicians, even if they can't change the hiring practices of their permanent membership just yet. So change is happening, and philanthropy can be a catalyst, but it's also the work on the ground.
Absolutely. Doug, this question's for you. It's great to hear you talk about your own personal work, addressing your own privileges. How do you encourage colleagues, peers to do the same work?
So this is one of the areas I've made some pretty wonderful mistakes in, because I actually, 2 years ago, I had a 360 done, 360 evaluation, and 45 people responded to this. And I got 2 comments that said, I wish Doug would live his equity journey a little bit quieter. I wish, the second comment was, I think you can do this without making others feel uncomfortable. And so, I've learned lots of things from that, but one of the things I'm doing is that, and a lesson that I learned, and from teachers that left lessons long ago, like James Baldwin and Langston Hughes, and teachers that are with us now, like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others, and Dwan Dandridge and Meredith Freeman, and people that I learned from now, that white men in particular have to talk to other white men. And so I'm placing myself into spots where I'm doing a book study on this book called White Supremacy and Me. Well, I'd already read that book with a couple of really, sort of in the spirit white folk. And then I got asked to read it with some folks, and 2 of them I knew had very different views than me. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll do it again because I need to listen to what they have to say. I think that it's not everybody's work, but it is my work to talk to other white men in particular, and to call them in, not because I know what to tell them, but what I know is that we need to be talking to each other. And so I've asked for this locally for our own foundation leads to do this. And I'm a part of a national group. It was open to everyone, and 6 people have shown up. And so, okay, so that's what we have to do. That's part of our work. That's part of our emotional labor, instead of what we've done primarily over time, which is we go to DEI conferences sitting primarily with people of color. And, we need to be talking to each other, learning lessons people have left for us that are willing to work with us, but it's our responsibility.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you for making yourself vulnerable like that. That's a gift. So here's a question. In the arts world, we call it the opportunity gap. In the healthcare field, we call it the healthcare gap. In education, we call it the opportunity gap. What would happen if all funders gathered together and made their mission the elimination of white supremacy and racism? What would change? So in other words, we're all fighting the same issue across all these systems, right? And if we're all fighting the same issue, what does it look like when we band together to eradicate that? Margaret?
Wow. Well, it would have to be a very comprehensive plan if we were serious. But some of us are doing some of that work already. Mellon is funding across the educational institutions and is now addressing social justice through all of its work. At Ford, we are funding across the civil rights, reproductive rights, and work, and we are investing in primarily in our creative sector stories about and by and told by Black, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous, and disabled people. The reason that's important, particularly in journalism and the arts, is that we need to counter monuments that are out there. We need to counter white supremacist narratives that have been with us for 300 years. And that's a lot of work. But we can do that through the arts. We can do that through education. We can do that through changing laws and changing the culture. So that's my mini strategy.
Powerful. And yet still, when you say it out loud, it's super powerful. Susan, this question is for you. Can you give a personal example that highlights a relationship you have cultivated with a BIPOC-led focused organization that exemplifies the mutual respect? What elements did you see that were present that led to its success?
Oh, wow, what a great question. I could use Sphinx, but I guess that's a little too easy. So I'll use the International Association of Blacks in Dance, which is a service organization that has been in existence for 40 years and was volunteer-led until 5 years ago. And I met Denise Saunders Thompson at a Dance USA conference. And IABD had started because they were not getting representation at organizations like Dance USA, but there Denise was at the conference. And I saw an actually extraordinary visionary leader. So we made an initial grant and we put her on salary. That was the first thing we did, so she could quit her day job and become full-time at IABD. And the next thing we did was to bring IABD into an initiative we had started the previous year called Comprehensive Organizational Health, which was designed to elevate and make more stable organizations that punched above their weight. Our initial cohort had been with the National Performance Network, which is a white-led organization, but the participants in that program were either BIPOC, we weren't calling it BIPOC at that point, or community or rural organizations. So we created a new cohort for IABD, and we took them through a 3-phase project where the 5 founding organizations, all led by women in 4 of the 5 still alive and working into their 80s, and we gave them a capitalization opportunities. When we were working with NPN, we called it recovery capital. It was the first phase, and they said, we're not recovering from anything. So I had to dial back what recovery capital was, so that became general operating support. A partnership with Nonprofit Finance Fund did technical and financial consultancies, a deep dive with them. And IABD said it wasn't enough just to just fund the 5 funders, we need a collective, and we adjusted that program with them to accommodate the collective. So 25 organizations in IABD had a modified version of what we were offering to the 5 founding organizations. And my board meeting in March, I will be recommending a second cohort of support for this program. So this was a learning opportunity. It was a capitalization opportunity. Capitalization is not sexy. But watching those organizations, whether the pandemic this year has been so inspiring to me personally, and I've learned so much from the leadership of these 5 women and building trust with them and being humble in their presence and understanding the lived experience that they brought back to their work. And that partially they were small budget organizations because they didn't pay themselves, has been a tremendous learning experience for me. And so I hope that's a good example.
It's a great example, Susan. Thanks so much. And I wish we had so much more time to dig deep into these very interesting issues and topics and examples. And an hour has flown by. I want to thank each of you, Doug, Margaret. Seems as if we may have lost Doug. No, there you are. Doug, Margaret, and Susan, for your thoughts and your insights and your candor. It's been great to sit in dialogue with you, and wishing you all of the success and impact that you seek to make with organizations you are working with and within your own organizations. Also a very, very immense thank you to founder Erin Dworkin, Afa Dworkin, and also want to give a big shout out to Abigail Vinman, who, girl, I don't know how you've been doing this, but you deserve a nice long nap after this. Kudos to you for running an incredible event. Also want to—
Thank you, Naimah.
Thank you,
Great.
Naimah.
Thank you, Naimah.
Great,
Thank you, Sphinx.
great facilitator.
Oh,
Great
my
questions.
goodness. Thank you. And thanks to all the questions from the audience. They were really good. Also want to thank all of the Black, Indigenous, Latine, people of color artists around the globe who, because of and in spite of countervailing challenges for centuries, decades, look, we don't have to go back centuries, today are creating beautiful art and doing it with passion and joy and unapologetically. So it's that kind of Black joy and that kind of joy that comes from that cultural experience that I'm sitting in today. I want to celebrate that and end with a quote from Bell Hooks. And what Bell Hooks says is, the function of art is doing more than telling it like it is. It is to imagine what's possible. So thanks to each of you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference experience. Thank you.
You too. Thank
Nice
you.
to see
Bye.
you, Susan. Nice to see you.
You too, Margaret.